Blockbuster almost bought Netflix, but almost doesn't count. In September 2000, Netflix execs were down on their luck. Before the company started heading south, they had contacted numerous companies for a deal. Blockbuster had been unavailable by phone for months. When they finally called back, they ordered the Netflix directors across the states and nailed their coffin. The last part of our video has more on the conversation and the coffin. But first, let's look at a number of most expensive mistakes in all history. In 2014, French train company SNCF made an expensive mistake by purchasing 2,000 trains that were too large. Most of their platforms were too narrow to fit the new trains. This little situation cost them 50 million euros. The derailment started when procurement neglected to factor in measurements of the train platforms that had been built more than 50 years earlier. Expanding the 1,300 platforms to accommodate their trains took 2 years. This process was not only most expensive, but it was also time-consuming. You must have heard the story about Harry Potter. You may not have read the books or watched the movies, but you have at least heard the name J.K. Rowling as the author of the books, and she definitely had humble beginnings. She wrote the Harry Potter series on mostly scrap paper. She has shared a couple of her rejection letters on Twitter to inspire her many followers. One publisher says, "I regret that we have reluctantly come to the conclusion that we could not publish with commercial success." Well, Harry Potter book sales alone have grossed approximately $7.7 billion. Most expensive mistake indeed. In 2005, Yahoo owned 30% of Alibaba. Yes, the mega-profitable Chinese multinational e-commerce technology and retail behemoth. 7 years later, they sold half their stake to Alibaba at $13 a share. It seemed like a good deal at the time. Yahoo made $7.6 billion. In 2014, Alibaba went public and broke records when their stock rose to $68 a share. Today, the shares in Alibaba are worth $150. What a terrible business mistake. Due to bad construction practices, a residential complex in Shanghai started tipping. A 4.6-meter car park was being dug on one side of the building. On the side opposite the underground car park, 10 meters of soil from the pit was piled up against the residential block. Eventually, the complex toppled towards the car park just after the close of day. Unfortunately, a worker who had gone back to retrieve some tools lost his life under the rubble. A real estate company responsible for this situation had been ignoring warning signs about the mud pile. Just by moving the soil, they would have saved one man's life and approximately $800,000. A tragic and expensive mistake in all history. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, a tragedy that still sends shivers down the spines of many around the world, was started by a test. During this expensive test, equipment in 4 reactors went out of control, leading to explosion of radioactive materials across the factory and into residential areas. In 1986, disaster resulted in the loss of between 93,000 and 200,000 lives. It also resulted in millions of cases of health side effects in more than 3 generations of the victims. The disaster cost a massive £230 billion in cleanup and an unknown value in lost farmland. The total loss at today's inflated rate stands at a staggering £464 billion. What an expensive fail. In the 1970s, the technology firm Xerox had already created a personal computer that could be controlled by a mouse. However, the firm never sold it. About a decade later, Xerox invited Steve Jobs and others from Apple Inc. to visit their research and development facilities in exchange for $1 million worth of Apple shares. Unfortunately for Xerox, Apple made use of the PC idea and launched it as their own later. Though Xerox's shares are now worth $9 billion, the Mac maker's shared value is a whopping $355 billion. Ford Motor Company is one of the oldest firms in automotive history, but it has made its share of mistakes. In 1957, Ford invested $160 million in the development of the Edsel model. The car derived its name from Edsel Ford, son of the company founder Henry Ford. At launch, the car was too expensive, used up too much gas, and was mocked in the press. A redesigned 1959 Edsel debuted to better reviews, but the damage had already been done. J.C. Doyle, an Edsel marketing manager, even went so far as blaming the American public for the failed launch. On January 10, 2000, AOL bought Time Warner for $106.2 billion. Though it was the peak of the information technology boom, the deal proved to be a colossal mistake as the returns were below expectations. In 2009, AOL decided to split with Time Warner, and the two were valued at $1.1 billion and $25.8 billion, respectively. When an 80-year-old parishioner noticed the fresco Ecce Homo and the Sanctuary of Mercy Church at Barjona was fading, she knew how to restore it. At least she thought she did. The restored result looks a tad different from the original piece. This prompted jokesters on the internet to redub the painting Ecce Mono. The original painting may be ruined, but there is a positive side to this situation. The fact is, many travelers flocked to Borgia to behold the ruin. In turn, the church began charging people, generating 50,000 euros for charity. In 1912, the Titanic was the largest passenger ship in history. The gigantic vessel hit an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and began to lose buoyancy. Nicknamed the Unsinkable, the Titanic hit the bottom of the Atlantic on its very first voyage, a most expensive fail and tragedy in history. On the fateful April 15, 1912 evening, the cruise ship had scraped its right side on a huge glacier, causing the vessel to take in water and sink. Sadly, over 1,500 people died. The monetary loss is estimated to be $7.5 million. After filming Justice League, Warner Brothers realized that a couple of scenes needed to be added. However, Henry Cavill had already begun shooting for a different film, Mission Impossible Fallout. This scheduling problem quickly became a hairy situation, literally. Cavill's role in his other movie required him to grow a mustache. Paramount didn't want to let him shave to reshoot his scenes as Superman. However, Warner Brothers begged him to let him shave it. Coordinating the reshots cost the brothers money, $25 million. On top of that, the studio had to pay the visual effects crew to remove Superman's mustache in those scenes. There are times when you look back at your career and think, crap, I really screwed up that one. That's what former Blockbuster CEO John Antioco said to himself every time he remembers a meeting he had in Dallas in September 2000. Oh, and every time he streams a movie. In his new book, That Will Never Work, Netflix co-founder Mark Randolph describes a meeting he attended with Blockbuster CEO John Antioco, along with Netflix co-founder Reed Hastings and its then CFO Barry McCarthy at Blockbuster headquarters in Dallas. Everyone from Blockbuster who was at the meeting must cringe when they think back to it now. The company could have bought Netflix that day for $50 million, but its CEO didn't even bother to consider the possibility. He seemed to see it as a great big joke. The evening before the meeting, Randolph, Hastings, and McCarthy were in rural California at Netflix's first ever corporate retreat when McCarthy got word that Blockbuster wanted to meet with them. At the time, Netflix was in trouble. The dot-com crash had made its once rosy future look grim. The idea of a DVD by mail rental service, which was all that was possible in that area of slower downloads, was catching on, but not quickly enough for the company to be anywhere near profitable. 2 years earlier and in headier economic times, Hastings and Randolph had turned down the opportunity to be acquired by Amazon. Now, acquisition by Blockbuster seemed like the perfect solution and the perfect lifeline to keep Netflix afloat. With this in mind, Netflix executives have been requesting a meeting with Blockbuster's leadership for months. Now, word came down through that Blockbuster wanted to meet with them at 11:30 the following morning in Dallas, 12 hours away. Let's pause for a moment and contemplate the sheer arrogance of this offer. After someone had been requesting a meeting with you for months, finally agree to meet with them at a time and place where it's physically impossible for them to get to, except maybe through a Star Trek-style transporter. Hastings, who has described entrepreneurship as jumping out of a plane in the confidence that you can catch a passing bird, pointed out that they could make it if they chartered a plane for 5 a.m. the following day. Probably even have enough time to grab an espresso, he added. McCarthy objected that this would cost at least $20,000 when the company was well on its way to lost money and having to close its doors. We've waited months for this meeting, Hastings replied. We stand to lose at least $50 million this year. Whether we pull this off or not, another 20 grand won't make a difference. The logic of this was inescapable. The three men chartered a plane, Vanna White's plane as it turned out, and off they went. At Blockbuster's Dallas headquarters, the three visitors were met with an exhibition of wealth and power. From the building, which Randolph described as an unbroken cube of steel and glass, to the loafers worn by CEO John Antioco. His loafers probably cost more than my car, Randolph writes. Antioco had every reason to treat himself to luxury footwear. He had arrived at Blockbuster 2 years earlier when the once successful company was on a slide due to some poor business decisions, such as trying to sell apparel. He not only turned Blockbuster's fortunes around, he had led it through a successful IPO that raised $465 million the previous year. Hastings quickly ran over Blockbuster's strengths and then noted that there were areas where it could benefit from Netflix's market position and expertise. "We should join forces," he said. "We will run the online part of the combined business. You will focus on the stores. We will find the synergies that come from combination. It will truly be a case of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts." Antioco's response is probably very high on list of things I wish I'd never said. The dot-com hysteria is completely overblown. Blockbuster General Counsel Ed Steed then explained how the business models of Netflix and just about every other online business were not sustainable and would never make money. With that, the deal went up in a whiff of smoke. Randolph's story is one more tale of a scrappy startup disruptor mortally wounding a long-established industry. But there's also an important business lesson: never ever be arrogant. Even if the person sitting in front of you has said something that seems absurd, even if it makes you want to laugh, pause for a moment and give it serious consideration. If only Antioco had done that, the meeting might have ended differently. Blockbuster could have made a lower offer for Netflix, which the founders might have accepted given their shaky finances. Or the two companies could have worked out some sort of partnership that could have given Blockbuster the benefit of Netflix's online expertise without Blockbuster actually buying Netflix. If Antioco and Steed had considered any of this, history could have turned out very differently for Blockbuster and its 25,000 employees. In 2010, Blockbuster declared bankruptcy, and by 2014, all corporate-owned stores had shuttered. That left locally owned franchises like the one in Bend to fend for themselves. One by one, they also closed. Which one is the greatest mistake? What is the reason behind these mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Like always, if you enjoyed it, be sure to give us a big thumbs up and leave us some love in the comments section. To keep up to date with all of our awesome videos, be sure to hit subscribe and turn your notifications on to never miss a thing. Until next time, do take care of yourself.